Happy Sunday, everyone, and Happy New Year. Here we go, 2023. I'm excited, both for today's topic, but also for many, many topics to come in the weeks ahead. I got a lot of fun stuff prepared that I've been researching and thinking about. Today, I wanted to talk about this concept of the New World Order and its connection to the church, maybe, kind of some troubling intermingling of church and globalist conspiratorial empire. So we'll get into that in a minute. I was in Hawaii this past week on vacation with the family. Among other places, we went to Pearl Harbor. I'd never been to Oahu before, so went all around Pearl Harbor, visited all the museums and so forth. And before going, I was talking to my kids about, my perspective on Pearl Harbor, that I don't believe it was a total surprise. I believe, and there's evidence that there was forewarning and knowledge of an attack, and that, critical information was being withheld from, some of the military commanders and generals. And so clearly a lot of people were caught off guard, but I tend to believe that FDR's administration knew what was coming and wanted it to happen because they wanted to draw America into the war. FDR, in the weeks prior to the Pearl Harbor attack in December 1941, had been campaigning for re-election, repeatedly promising people, we're not going to send your boys to war, we're not going to go to war, because that was the sentiment at the time. World War I had been a total disaster, it was just a mess. And a lot of those soldiers were now parents themselves, and they didn't want their kids to go off to war. And so the American public was not in favor of going to war. But, FDR and his other central planning cronies wanted warfare because it would allow them to acquire power and influence. And, that trend certainly continues today. So I think it was, in a sense, a false flag incident, Pearl Harbor was. And that even if you take the position that it was a true surprise, that no one in the government had any knowledge of it happening, there were clearly those who had a desire for it to happen, including FDR, right? Because American public, the opinion of the public drastically shifted, as happens in a false flag attack, when people think that we've been attacked, or when we actually have been attacked, but they think, how dare these people, we need to go fight them, and suddenly everyone wants to go back to war. Happens again and again and again. So we're at the Pearl Harbor Museum, and, I'm reflecting on and talking to my kids about, World War II and how radically it remade the kind of global distribution of political power, right? And so I was reading a bunch of stuff to them and brushing up myself, and it was clear back in 1939, so 2 years prior to Pearl Harbor, that the Pope at the time, he issued this, public address, and he's like, we need a stable international organization after the war. So the Pope is now calling for basically a global government. And just a month later, FDR replies by letter. He says that it was his belief that while no spiritual or civic leader could now define a specific structure for the future, the time will surely come. Meanwhile, the United States would encourage a closer association between those in every part of the world, those in religion and those in government who have a common purpose. It was in December 1941, when Churchill was visiting for 3 weeks, that Roosevelt first proposed using the term United Nations to refer to the Allies. And shortly thereafter, there was a declaration. There was a kind of a letter, declaration signed on to by a whole bunch of the Allied countries. And in March, so not long after this, they formed the Commission to Study the Bases of a Just and Durable Peace. This was headed by John Foster Dulles, who later headed the CIA and oversaw the MK-Ultra program, after whom an airport back east has been named. He's an interesting character on his own. But he's heading up this commission to study a just and durable peace. Keep in mind, there's a global war happening, right? And so they're trying to figure out how we can reorganize political affairs in a post-war world that will deter the Hitlers of the world from, rising up in the future. And so this commission ends up proposing a far more radical solution. They propose a global government complete with a parliament, an international court, a bunch of regulatory agencies. The global government would have the power to regulate international trade, settle disputes between member nations, control everyone's military, except those needed to maintain domestic order. And so after the war at the Yalta Conference, it was this 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin agreed together to turn the United Nations, what was a wartime alliance of countries, into a post-war international organization called the United Nations. And so they structured the organization. They created the United Nations Security Council. And what I find interesting about this was new to me, that when they were discussing how they would create the United Nations, it was Stalin who insisted on having a veto. In other words, if we're all going to join as countries into this United Nations, we need the ability to veto something so that we can't, be controlled by this global government. And FDR didn't like that. FDR was pushing against that. He finally relented, but it was Stalin. Stalin is the reason why the United Nations did not, at the outset, turn into a true global government to subsume and supersede local governments. The United Nations, which we're going to talk almost entirely about today, is a corrupt, horrible institution. But it's also largely toothless, right? They have the ability to issue statements and pass resolutions and whatever, right? But they can't control a country. And oddly enough, we have Stalin to thank for that. It could have easily gone the other way, that right there at the outset, the United Nations would have been created as a way to bind countries to the, views of the United Nations. Very interesting. So, okay, we got this United Nations now, and they had a charter written, and, the Soviets and communist sympathizers like Alger Hiss and all these people in America are involved in creating the United Nations Charter. And they launched it in San Francisco. And, you look at people like the current Secretary General, the current head of the United Nations. He was in the Socialist Party in Portugal. He was the president of Socialist International for several years before he got his top job at the United Nations. A couple years ago, he was speaking at an event honoring Nelson Mandela. And he said this guy's name is Antonio Gutierrez. And he said that the pandemic had shown that the world needs a transformative political reorganization to fix inequalities and threats to the environment. He says it has laid bare risks we have ignored for decades: inadequate health systems, gaps in social protection, structural inequalities, environmental degradation, and the climate crisis. So, you put a socialist in charge, and most of these people are all, central planning, bureaucrats and regulators and socialists and everything else, right? My concern, and what we're going to talk about a little bit later in this musing, is that, the church, or we members of the church, should be at the forefront of repudiating this institution for reasons I'll get into. And yet what we find is there's a lot of cozying up to the United Nations and these global institutions instead. And that's the topic of the musing. But first, the United Nations has a variety of satellite organizations, sister organizations, initiatives and organizations tied to the United Nations. Certainly there's UNICEF, which, the church partners most closely with for distribution of, food to those in poverty. There's the Population Fund, or what many rightly refer to as the Depopulation Fund, since ultimately they are about trying to, increase reproductive, whatever they call it, control. And basically they want to encourage the birth rate to decline, as it does in industrialized nations when women enter the workplace and there's widespread birth control and everything else. The population decreases. You get Bill Gates and all the others cheering for that, right? Because they think that the world is overpopulated. So you got the Population Fund. You have the Human Rights Council on which sits, Russia and China and the ludicrousness of various countries being on this Human Rights Council that, violate human rights. One could argue the same about the United States. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. These are the guys who repeatedly, preach doom and fear porn about, the sky is falling. I found this webpage that archives all these claims that have been made over the decades of, climate change is going to destroy the world in the next 4 years, back in 1980, whatever, right? Oh, in 1993, we only have 4 more years to stop, global warming. Oh, we only have 7 more years. We have to pass this really big, change all these laws and, shut down drilling and everything else, right? And over and over and over again, these crazy predictions that obviously all fail to materialize. But over and over again, you get this United Nations organization, pumping that propaganda out there and all the willing corporate media going along with it. You got the World Health Organization. This is a UN agency, right? I don't think I really need to get into how preposterous this organization is and how wrong they are and how they push propaganda and how they don't follow science, but it's really about a political narrative that they're using science as a front for. You have the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations, Gavi. This is a organization that the church has funded because the church is very pro-vaccine, has been for a long time. And so Gavi's gotten millions of dollars from the LDS Church. So the UN has all these satellite organizations, right? And it's this massive institution full of bureaucrats taking tons of taxpayer dollars, but it is ultimately a pseudo-global government that doesn't have a lot of teeth and yet is utilized by those in power to badger their political opponents and to leverage political power against what they're trying to push against. So let me share a few headlines to illustrate the problem, and then we're going to get into kind of the church connections to the United Nations and why I find this so much of a concern. Here, it's a new year. We're talking about New World Order. We got the Great Reset and all this garbage where anytime there is a crisis, whether it's a real one or a manufactured one, there are people laying in wait to exploit that, right? Never let a good crisis go to waste, as Rahm Emanuel said. And wanting to reshape, the political landscape. You got, Dr. Evil Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum and all these bozos out there saying this stuff. This is an opportunity. Hey, this is a great thing. We need to, remake landscape, and we need to, do all these things to fix climate change and solve income inequality and all these things, right? And so they welcome or manufacture these crises to further their agenda. Again, we should be at the forefront of recognizing that and pushing back against it, and we're not. And some of us are actually taking us in the wrong direction. I'll name names in just a few minutes. Here's some headlines to illustrate the problems with the United Nations. I'm not going to get into the articles or the topics. I'm just going to rattle off some headlines just to wet your whistle. By no means is this comprehensive. This is just a quick selection of headlines. United Nations tells rich countries to pay $2 trillion a year for quote-unquote climate justice. United Nations claims climate catastrophe now almost unavoidable. United Nations diplomat dodges New York City rape thanks to diplomatic immunity. That was a weird one. I read that full story. Very disconcerting. But then you read this next one, and it's not too surprising. United Nations peacekeepers from 12 countries have fathered and abandoned thousands of children over the past 20 years in the Democratic Republic of Congo. United Nations says, embrace high gas prices for the sake of Mother Earth. United Nations demands $600 million in taxpayer money to help the Taliban. United Nations recruited over 100,000 quote-unquote digital first responders to push establishment COVID narrative. United Nations rights chief, this was like the Human Rights Council or whatever they're called, the rights chief demands reparations for slavery, colonial rule, and racism. The Biden United Nations ambassador blasts the United States, rips white supremacy within founding documents and principles. United Nations chooses teen prostitution advocate for top human rights post. 2 more. Scandal-ridden World Health Organization listening in on online conversations to counter quote-unquote fake COVID-19 news. United Nations human rights chief tries to scare countries into continuing lockdowns. Okay, so over and over and over again, all this garbage is being promulgated, and this organization is corrupt. It is a fountain of evil. It is the playground of globalists trying to, suppress people's freedoms in the name of that very freedom. It's Orwellian doublespeak institutionalized. It's just ridiculous. And out front of their headquarters, for those of you watching, I'll show you this, and I'll describe it for those who are just listening to the audio. Here's this magnificent statue right outside of their headquarters. It's this kind of jaguar or tiger-looking creature with massive wings, painted all kinds of fun colors. And you think, oh, that's like a let me turn this back around. That's, a clever art piece, right? But then you go read in Daniel 7, and 4 great beasts came up from the sea, diverse one from another. The first was like a lion, and had eagle's wings. I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth, and made stand upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it. And in Revelation, when John has his vision, and he says, the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power, and his seat, and great authority. And it was given unto him to make war with the saints, and overcome them. And power was given him over all kindreds, and tongues, and nations. I mean, that statue, to me, looks like literally someone was just reading the book of Revelation, said, let's make a statue about this, and put it out front of the United Nations. So much of this stuff I found over the years is very open. People think often that conspiracy and secret combination kind of stuff, it's in the shadows, it's totally secret, right? And I'm not convinced that that's true. I'm convinced that they've gotten away with a lot of things in the light of day. They've been very kind of open with their declarations, and no one believes them or takes them at face value. And those who do are dismissed by the corporate media and others as being, fringe kooks. And so they feel comfortable in just advancing their agenda semi-openly, seeing what they can get away with. So, no, I don't think that statue was created, I don't know. Who knows the genesis of this thing? And yet it's a pretty accurate depiction of the beast in Revelation. The great and abominable church did a musing on that a few weeks ago, and ultimately the great whore of the earth. And I think the United Nations is definitely one piece of that, as are many of these other institutions and, frankly, political parties and things here in America as well. Okay, United Nations. One of the big things that they're pushing right now is Agenda 2030. This was created in 2015. It was a revamp of Agenda 21, a little upgrade. And these are the kind of ambitious goals, you might say, for the United Nations to pursue. I'm going to talk about Agenda 2030, and then we're going to get into the church connections. So hang with me. So Agenda 2030 is 17 different global goals. I'm going to, for those of you watching here on Facebook or later on YouTube. So here's the graphic of the sustainable goals, right? No poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, reducing inequalities, clean water, climate action, all these things. And those are the big lofty goals under Agenda 2030. Now here's the preamble from Agenda 2030. It says, and this is right from their website, this agenda is a plan of action for people, planet, and prosperity. It also seeks to strengthen universal peace in larger freedom. What does that mean? We recognize that eradicating poverty in all its forms and dimensions, including extreme poverty, is the greatest global challenge and an indispensable requirement for sustainable development. All countries and all stakeholders acting in collaborative partnership will implement this plan. We are resolved to free the human race from the tyranny of poverty and want to heal and secure our planet. We are determined to take the bold and transformative steps which are urgently needed to shift the world onto a sustainable and resilient path. Okay, I mean, that sounds fine, right? Like, oops, we want everyone to be healthy, and we want them to be prosperous, and we want them to have clean water, and but again, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? These lofty goals, it ultimately boils down to how are they being accomplished. The United Nations and its member organizations, these different countries, can only do so through force. Right? It is violence. It is using the coercive means of the state to shape society, contrasted against voluntary action and persuasion. I mean, God's commandments are lofty goals, right? He wants us to eradicate poverty. He wants us to be good stewards of the earth, right? We're commanded to do all these things to help others, to, lift up the hands that hang down, strengthen the feeble knees and everything else. But we don't do it through the state. That's why all these morons who think that Jesus was a socialist or that socialist ideas are compatible with the gospel are totally deluded. Because central to this socialist, communist, central planning, statist approach to solving these problems is violence. It is force. Agenda 2030's own implementation handbook, which you can read on its website, I went and copied and pasted these things. They talk about how they propose implementing these actions. Remember, the agenda is a plan of action that all of their member organizations and countries have to implement. And so they propose to implement Agenda 2030 through expanding taxation. They want more efficient tax collection. They want to empower the IMF and the World Bank, horribly corrupt institutions that are just robbing poorer countries. They want them to have access to everyone's financial information. They say they invite the IMF and the World Bank and the United Nations to assist countries in basically documenting everyone's financial transactions. We see that in America with your $600 Venmo transactions now, right? Everything is under the kind of scrutiny of the state. They want to be able to document and impose their will on it. Just under the table stuff gone, right? Illicit market, the gray market, the unbanked, everything. Like, they want access to everyone. They want to manipulate the market and regulate private businesses. They say to better, this is their direct quote, to better align private sector incentives with public goals, including incentivizing the private sector to adopt sustainable practices and foster long-term quality investment. So they want to manipulate the private sector through incentives to align it to the United Nations goals under Agenda 2030. So it's like this dozens of pages in this implementation handbook, and it's all government. It's all coercion. It's all, bossing people around. These lofty goals, trying to help other people, trying to lift people out of poverty, can only morally be achieved through persuasion and voluntary action. So at its core, like the government in general, the United Nations is effectively a satanic enterprise whereby people are pursuing purportedly noble ends. I don't necessarily believe that everyone in the United Nations really is trying to do all these lofty, amazing things. I think there's some corrupt, evil people there, right? But setting that aside, these lofty, noble goals, they're trying to achieve in completely the wrong way. Okay, let's get to the church. Now, 3 years ago, the church changed the temple recommend questions. Before then, one of the questions, you'll remember this, was, do you support, affiliate with, or agree with any group or individual whose teachings or practices are contrary to or oppose those accepted by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? And I think I've shared maybe on this musing or on social media in the past, I would always say like, oh yeah, I'm a member of the Republican Party. And the bishop or the stake, president or council or whatever would always, smile because they usually were as well. And we would laugh and then move on. But I think the United Nations absolutely qualifies here, right? An individual whose practices are contrary, like especially if you dig into those headlines, those articles I mentioned, and even just the fundamental nature itself of how the United Nations is operating. For those who don't know, the question was changed to this: do you support or promote any teachings, practices, or doctrine contrary to those of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? And frankly, with how many traditions of the fathers there are and all this, idolatry that we have in the church, that people aren't answering that question, I think, too honestly. Otherwise, I think far fewer people would get temple recommends. But anyways, okay. So August 2019, around the same time they changed the temple recommend questions. Music and the spoken word is happening. And there's kind of a vice president something or other. I forgot to write down his name, but there's this guy in the upper echelons of the United Nations in Salt Lake at the time. And he's sitting in music and the spoken word in the tabernacle. They're doing their little tour of Temple Square and taking them around all these places. So they're sitting there listening to music and the spoken word. And Lloyd Newell stands up and begins to say this. In the spring, I should try and emulate his smirky, I'm not even going to try. In the spring of 1945, with the world still staggering from the most devastating war in human history, leaders from 50 nations gathered in San Francisco with admittedly high aspirations to create an international organization that would, quote, save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Thus, the United Nations was born with a charter that also included the aim to promote human rights, international law, and a higher standard of living around the world. Of course, there have been wars since 1945. This is Lloyd Newell continuing. Although, thankfully, none as deadly as World War II. Human rights and international law are still violated far too often around the world. And while the overall standard of living is higher, too many people still live in substandard conditions. Yet these lofty purposes remain unchanged almost 75 years later. Whatever critics might say about the UN's accomplishments, one cannot accuse it of having mediocre goals. As one historian said, the UN's greatest challenge has been the wide gap between its ambitions and its capacities. In other words, how much taxes and political power it has to accomplish those ambitions. Finally, Lloyd Newell, one journalist has observed that while the United Nations has never fulfilled the hopes of its founders, it has accomplished a good deal nevertheless. So I watched this live. I think my family and I happened to be watching it that morning before church, and I was just like, what the hell are we listening to? Just this glowing adoration of the United Nations from an official church program. I find out later that one of the UN guys is sitting there, so presumably they're trying to blow smoke up his bum for some reason and make him feel good. And so they have they're showing all the flags of all the Caesarean states around the world, and I just remember watching that like, what is going on? Because I grew up in kind of the Bensonian, church where he and McKay and others were lambasting the United Nations, saying, get out of there. It's a bunch of communists, right? Like, it's a bunch of central planners that don't support the Constitution, don't support individual liberty. They're fighting against it. And whatever the so-called lofty purposes were at the very outset of trying to stop another war from happening, it became the globalists' playground to dominate and control people and push their political agendas and now their crazy left-wing weird gender views and climate garbage and everything, all designed to reduce freedom and increase control. This very, at its core, at its root, this satanic enterprise of reducing the freedom of individuals, not augmenting it, not increasing it. And so I grew up in a church that was full of leaders and others saying, get us out of this. This is not consistent with the Constitution. This is not consistent with freedom. And, things have been quiet over the past 2-3 decades. No one's really talked about it in the church. And then I'm watching music in the spoken word. I'm like, whoa, what is going on? Like, why all the praise all of a sudden? Why all the fluffy stuff? And then, I find out that the church is a member of the Faith Advisory Council of the UN Interagency Task Force on Religion and Sustainable Development. I mean, these terms are like 43 words long. Or that, the Deseret Management Corporation, who basically owns like KSL and Deseret News and Bonneville and like all the church-owned businesses, that they hired this senior vice president of global reach. His name's Aaron Sherinian. And previously, he was the chief communications officer at the United Nations Foundation. You go look at his social media, and he's pushing all kinds of trans stuff and gay marriage, championing gay marriage and talking about we need to fund the United Nations more and everything. It's like, why is the church hiring someone like this? What happened to the church I grew up in? It's 180 on this issue where before it was get us out and they're horrible and they're evil. And now it's this intermingling, right? And I recommended this book before for those who can't see, Moroni and the Swastika. Fantastic book, written by a non-LDS historian. It chronicles the Mormons in Nazi Germany. And I've shared in the past how, especially early on last year when I did a musing about the Jehovah's Witnesses, how I admire them, historically at least, for standing up for their faith, standing up to the Nazis, not pledging allegiance to the flag, being just excoriated by their peers in Germany or America, for being insufficiently patriotic and the rest. And how I admire them for doing what, Lehi and Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Isaiah and all these people in biblical and scriptural history, when they stood up to their respective Caesars and, stood for what was right. So there's a lot of interesting information about the Jehovah's Witnesses by contrast in this book, but it focuses, of course, on our church and the interactions there with the Nazis. And so what was interesting to me is that in reading this book years ago when it was published, let's see, it was published in 2015. So I read it right when it came out. What was interesting to me reading this book is seeing how eager many members of the church leadership, were in trying to ingratiate themselves with the Nazis. And I'm bringing this up because I'm going to go back to the United Nations and, talk about that similarly. So here's a brief quote from Moroni and the Swastika. It said, many Mormon officials strove to fit into the Third Reich by emphasizing points of congruence between their church and Hitler's regime. These were not spontaneous or localized efforts, but instead reflected a centralized strategy mandated by senior ecclesiastical leaders, the American Mormon mission presidents who acted under guidance from church headquarters in Salt Lake City. Their attempts proved successful. The Nazis banned no Mormon congregations from worship and persecuted few individual members, Helmut Hubeter notwithstanding. When a German Mormon or an American missionary ran afoul of the government, it was because of an individual transgression that would have imperiled any ordinary German during the Nazi regime. German Latter-day Saints and their American ecclesiastical leaders learned how to live under periodic state surveillance, but succeeded in surviving this scrutiny. However, in the process of proving that Mormonism posed no threat to the German state, especially in the pre-war period, LDS Church leaders exceeded the effort necessary for survival. The historical record reveals numerous efforts to court favor with the Nazi state, from stressing common interest in genealogical research to professing admiration for Hitler's carefully cultivated image as a non-smoking, non-drinking devotee of healthy living. And it goes on. Point is, this institutional decision on the church's part to ingratiate themselves. I did a whole musing many months ago about whether fighting for freedom is an institutional obligation or an individual one. In other words, should we be mad at the church for ingratiating itself to keep the doors open, right? To allow people to continue to worship, even when they're tearing out references to Jews in the Sunday school manuals and, surrendering missionary leaflets to the Gestapo and, right? Is that okay for the institution to just preserve as much open access as possible? Or should the institution be vocal in standing up for, truth and fighting these oppressors? It's a very interesting question. In that musing, I kind of came down in the middle. I can see both sides, but at a minimum, it's an individual obligation. We're directly commanded by God And the problem we run in our church culture is that when the institution isn't doing it, most members of the church become extremely apathetic and don't do anything because they look to the church for direction. They're slothful servants waiting to be commanded in all things. And so they think, oh, well, if the prophet thought it was important, he would tell us, even though we've been commanded by many prophets past to do exactly this, and the saints ignored them then, and they're ignoring them now. Okay, so what does that mean for the United Nations? Here's the church news from 2019. Now, the reason why music and the spoken word did what they did, and why that gentleman from the senior VP whatever at the United Nations was sitting there listening to music and the spoken word, is because they were all in town for this 68th annual United Nations Civil Society Conference. I attended it. Very icky feeling. I went to a bunch of the different breakouts. It was a bunch of just leftist, communist garbage about people trying to pass these big laws on climate change this and inequality that, and not a good feeling there. But I went because, as it says here in the church news, this is the first conference to be held in the United States outside of the United Nations headquarters in New York. Some likely questioned, says the church news, why Salt Lake? On a list of the most globally recognized cities in the United States, Salt Lake doesn't even make the top 20. But when selecting cities that align with the goals and principles upheld by the United Nations, that criterion made Salt Lake stand out. Salt Lake stood out, according to the church news, because the city, and presumably by implication the church, of course, has aligned goals and principles. Continuing in the church news, the United Nations and the church have worked together in an official capacity since 2011. Here's Sister Sharon Eubank. We'll get into her in just a moment. She said, it's important for the church to have these relationships because we're a multilateral organization. We work in multiple countries, multiple political systems, multiple cultures, and the United Nations does as well. When multiple countries are involved, you have to work with the United Nations. So it's good for us and a sign of maturity of the organization that Latter-day Saint Charities and the United Nations have this relationship. Finally, from the church news, with the theme for the 68th Civil Society Conference focused on creating sustainable and inclusive cities and communities, Sister Eubank explained just how closely the goals of the two global organizations are aligned in that purpose being sustainable and inclusive communities. Over the past 6 or so years in her work with Latter-day Saint Charities, Sister Eubank said the predominant focus has been with refugees. She says, quote, if you look at why people are forced from their homes, it's because of, what would you say? She says, it's because of intolerance versus inclusiveness, and because of environmental degradation, because they can't afford to stay or the climate doesn't allow them to stay. Huh? Okay, so let's get into this lady, Sharon Eubank. Up until recently, first counselor in the General Relief Society president, and director of LDS Charities, which is the kind of church agency or organization that oversees this kind of international distribution of aid to help, poor and malnourished and underprivileged people. I'm going to go through a few quotes from the esteemed Sister Sharon Eubank, and as you'll see, I don't really esteem her that much. Okay, 2018 at the Global Interfaith Forum, she said, the 2030 agenda, we just talked about that, the 17 goals and all the, more taxation, more regulation, more government to force everyone to do all these lofty things, right? Here's Sister Eubank. The 2030 agenda won't happen without religion. The way forward is to do just what this forum has as its goal. Invite and respect as many faith actors as possible, build understanding among them, and integrate them into every aspect of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals agenda. It will lead to the greatest success possible for equity, not equality, equity, justice, and peace. The next year, at the Second Global Summit on Religion, Peace, and Security, another United Nations event, she said, "The good that religion can do, especially when it comes to integrating or achieving sustainable development goals, is amplified when religious groups work in partnership with each other and with government and non-governmental actors." The same year at the United Nations World Food Program, she said that they had had a partnership for 5 or 6 years. It's one of our most significant partners. Same year in an event in Geneva, the church under Eubank's planning created this, what they call a side event. So they had all the official United Nations events going on, and they had their own little like side event where they welcomed a bunch of people who happened to be there in Geneva. She said this: "When it comes to multilateral," that means multiple countries, "multilateral humanitarian work, organizations have to work with the United Nations. They are simply the only organization that can effectively coordinate multilateral work." She said, "The Latter-day Saints-sponsored conference was a great opportunity to highlight the long-standing relationship Latter-day Saint Charities has had with various United Nations agencies and connected organizations, and will allow for continued work and collaboration on some of the topics and issues that are most important to Latter-day Saint Charities and the Church." And then 2021, COVID. There was a panel held with the G20 Interfaith Forum. G20 is this United Nations, kind of the top 20 countries. So they have an interfaith forum. I mean, the thing that you come to learn when researching the United Nations is like it's this beast with tentacles that reach everywhere, and like this organization spawned those 4 organizations, which have these 18 different initiatives, each of which have their own sub-agencies here and like task forces there. And it's just this massive bloat of bureaucracy and taxpayer dollars and people out there whose full-time job is to figure out how to propagandize people into compliance or dictate them through force into compliance. So here she is at this interfaith forum, co-sponsored by the International Center at BYU. They titled it "COVID Vaccination Challenges, Ethical Imperatives, and Local Realities." She said, "There's power of having trusted faith leaders. We've known for a long time that it is through the trusted voice of faith leaders that people can change their resistance to these things. But one of the new things that has happened is the blending of science, the incredible speed with which this vaccine was developed, and for faith communities to acknowledge that their faith in God and their trust in this scientific miracle are compatible and they work together. Because this is important to your health and the health of other people, so it is spiritually acceptable." Which is like totally an ends justifies the means. Because it's important for your health, it's spiritually acceptable. She was referring in part to the fact that the vaccines use a line of genetics from aborted fetuses. And so historically, Catholics and many Mormons have had issues with these vaccines that use human material derived from aborted fetuses. And she was praising the Pope for overcoming that issue where traditionally Catholics have always had a problem. And now the Pope got vaccinated himself and he said it's okay. And Eubanks in that statement was praising the Pope for using his religious authority to push other people to get the vaccine, to overcome their religious sentiments. And she said, right, the trusted voice of faith leaders can help people change their resistance. Parenthetically, this is what the governor of Utah said at the time too. And I've had many people message me after I alluded to information I'm not able to share, and they've been, "Oh, please share it, that I was in a meeting with some key people, and it was revealed how much of the church's promotion of the vaccines was instigated by the government, which knew that the church speaking out in favor of the vaccine would, as Sister Eubanks herself here says, help people change their resistance." So I'm not going to share any more about that, but I just said a little bit more about it, that for those of you who want to color in the lines, you're able to, because I said that I wouldn't reveal what was discussed in that meeting as a condition of having a seat at the table. And so this Sister Eubanks lady just to me seems like this leftist, globalist, progressive, like let me be a bit compassionate for a moment. I can understand from her point of view, running LDS charities and working in all these different countries, that you want economies of scale. You want efficiency. You want the best bang for your buck. So why reinvent the wheel? Why not piggyback on other institutions that already have a network and a system and access and all this kind of stuff, right? So it would make sense. If I were director of LDS Charities, I would at least strongly consider partnerships that would better help us meet our goals, better make an impact. But any leader of any organization knows that you have to balance considerations against other factors. You can't just myopically look and say, oh, you have to work with the United Nations because it's multiple countries, therefore we got to work with them, right? You can't just be so myopic and say, we got to do this thing. You have to balance it against other factors, such as, is this an organization that the church should closely affiliate with at all, right? Even if they have the same purported goals that we do, right? There are other factors in play to evaluate whether that's an organization that we want to align ourselves with, and then pump out the music and the spoken word and the church news and all this propaganda saying we're closely aligned. Our goals and principles, they're closely aligned. Like garbage. They're not, right? And so, but I can see from her vantage point about like, well, it kind of makes sense, but I think that's too myopic. And I don't think, there's other large relief organizations through which we can operate or partner with and collaborate with. And if needed, we go it alone. But I don't think that the ends justify the means. And I don't think trying to better leverage our charitable donations justifies a closer relationship with this very kind of communistic, corrupt, highly bureaucratic, leftist, progressive, statist institution that is telling people with the crazy statute out front that they are likely part of the, not likely, they are part of the, great whore in Babylon and all these things. So in 2019, President Ballard visited the UN. He said, this is a very important place for people of all nations, all cultures to gather together and try and resolve worldwide problems in the lives of Heavenly Father's children. Again, I can be flexible here and say, okay, it is an important place in the sense that it is a place of import, like being remarkable, like it's worthy of remark, doesn't make it positive, doesn't make it, praiseworthy thing. So, okay, it's a very important place. I'll stretch on that one. The following year, Elder Christofferson, you remember this conference talk. You can actually read into this both ways. I've pondered this. I've talked to people about it. I've read online what people are saying about it. So he's referring to this Agenda 2030 stuff that we've been going over, these sustainable development goals. And he says, in 2015, the United Nations adopted what was called the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. It was described as a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and the planet, now and into the future. The Agenda for Sustainable Development includes 17 goals to be achieved by the year 2030, such as no poverty, zero hunger, quality education, gender equality, clean water, sanitation, and decent work. He continues, the concept of sustainable development is an interesting and important one. Even more urgent, however, is the broader question of sustainable societies. And then he goes on in his talk to talk about what he thinks are sustainable societies and how it's through Jesus Christ and the principles of the gospel that we can actually achieve these sustainable societies. I think Elder Christofferson, who has attended some of these United Nations events, there's a photo of him and Sharon Eubank at one of them, and so he's kind of been involved there. My take on this talk is that he's kind of very gently calling out the bureaucrats and the central planners that their lofty goals can only be achieved through living the principles of Jesus Christ, which requires voluntary compliance and charity and not coercive mandates and central planning to control other people. He doesn't come out right and say that, which I think is unfortunate because I think we as a church culture suck at reading between the lines. And when things are kind of worded, I don't know, what's the word I'm looking for? When something is worded in a way that can be interpreted in different ways, then it just leaves an open question as to what was actually meant, and you lose the potency of maybe like a parable from Jesus where it's very clear what he meant and there is no really secondary interpretation. So with this talk from Elder Christofferson, I interpret that to mean that he's kind of knocking them a little bit and like, you're not going to achieve it through these worldly means. It's got to be through the gospel of Christ. He doesn't really come out and say it. He just refers to it and then pivots to say, instead of sustainable development, let's talk about sustainable societies. So it was kind of this praiseworthy thing at the beginning. Remember this talk a couple years ago. So I think that can kind of be interpreted either way. Now, again, for those watching on the phone, on the video. So here is the graphic of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's represented by this little, for those who can't see, it's this kind of color wheel, a circle with a lot of little parts of the circle that are all different colors. 17 of them, each of them representing a different goal, right? So the 17 goals we saw earlier, all these colored boxes right here, all 17 colors turned into this little circle. Okay, then next photo we see, for those listening, we see a bunch of people holding up these big color wheels and basically the same logo, the Sustainable Development United Nations logo. And then we see that they turned it into this cute little pin. So I'm showing a photo of someone holding one of these little lapel pins showing the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And then here's our friend Bill Gates, right? There's Bill Gates wearing one of the little lapel pins right there. And then, well, wait a minute, that's Sharon Eubank wearing one of the same pins, right? Big cheerleader in the church for the United Nations and all their tyrannical garbage. She's proudly wearing the pin. And then, wait a minute, that's Elder Razban wearing the same pin. What's going on? That's interesting, right? Okay. So you'll have to ask him why he's wearing one of those pins. But that was in a photo where he talked about how he was at a United Nations meeting and gave a Book of Mormon to the Indian ambassador. And I guess he's, I don't know, showing team spirit by wearing United Nations garbage. It's around this time, of course, that we start getting into all this good global citizen garbage that President Nelson starts referring to over and over again. April 2020, the church letter coming out saying, along with our commitment to be good global citizens, we respectfully assert that reasonable accommodations be extended to all people of faith as they strive to participate in rights that are foundational with their faith. That was early on in COVID, April 2020. Along with our commitment to be good global citizens. It was right then when church publications started referring to President Nelson as a global faith leader. Like these press releases started to be put out, and when he met the Pope and everything, like they started using the word global a lot. Historically, the church has not really used that. You go look it up and it's not really, used. But all of a sudden, global. It was January 2021. President Nelson, when his team posted on Twitter, Wendy and I were vaccinated today against COVID-19. We are thankful for the countless individuals who performed the work required to make this possible. We have prayed for this literal godsend. Those watching or listening to the audio can't see my facial reactions, unfortunately. Receiving the vaccine is part of our personal efforts to be good global citizens. Oh boy. And then in conference, just a few months later in April, he said, as you know, attendance at this general conference has been strictly limited as part of our efforts to be good global citizens and do all we can to limit the spread of COVID-19. Now, I said earlier that I kind of grew up in the Bensonian era, a lot of us did, where the United Nations was called out as a kind of communistic, central planning, anti-constitution, anti-sovereignty, anti-American, blah, blah, blah type of organization. So I can't do a musing about the United Nations and the church and not share a quote from my man Ezra. Okay, so here he is. I didn't write down what year he said this. Ezra Taft Benson. Among the nations of the world today, there are precious few common bonds that could help overcome the clash of cross purposes that inevitably must arise between groups with such divergent ethnic, linguistic, legal, religious, cultural, and political environments. To add fuel to the fire, the concept woven into all the present-day proposals for world government, the United Nations foremost among these, is one of unlimited governmental power to impose by force a monolithic set of values and conduct on all groups and individuals, whether they like it or not. Far from ensuring peace, such conditions can only enhance the chances of war. In this connection, it's interesting to point out that the late J. Reuben Clark, who was recently described as probably the greatest authority on the Constitution during the past 50 years, made in 1945, the year the United Nations Charter was adopted, made this prediction in his devastating and prophetic cursory analysis of the United Nations Charter. So here's Benson quoting J. Reuben Clark, who in the year that the United Nations Charter was being signed, said this: "There seems no reason to doubt that such real approval as the Charter has among the people is based upon the belief that if the Charter is put into effect, wars will end. The Charter will not certainly end war. Some will ask, why not? In the first place, there is no provision in the Charter itself that contemplates ending war. It is true the Charter provides for force to bring peace, but such use of force is itself war. It is true the Charter is built to prepare for war, not to promote peace. The Charter is a war document, not a peace document. Not only does the Charter organization not prevent future wars, but it makes it practically certain that we will have future wars. And as to such wars, it takes from us the power to declare them, to choose the side on which we shall fight, to determine what forces and military equipment we shall use in the war, and to control and command our sons who do the fighting." So we can't say we haven't been warned. And whether it's the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab, who's just a total nut job, or the Great Reset, or the Trilateral Commission, or the Bilderbergs, and the Bohemian Grove crazies, and the United Nations, and all the rest, there are an abundance of people who conspire to acquire power and wealth. It has happened throughout world history. It is certainly evident in scriptural history, particularly the Book of Mormon. We've been commanded to awake to this stuff, to not let these combinations get above us. That does not include colluding with them. That does not include supporting them and saying that we have common goals and principles, right? Just as was done with the Nazis, I think the same applies to the United Nations. We're supposed to see these institutions for what they are, not what they claim to be, right? They don't claim to be ruthlessly oppressive, sovereignty-eroding, corrupt bureaucracies to advance, statism and left-wing crazy ideologies. They don't claim to be that. You don't make progress by doing that. You do a false flag, right? You pretend. I mean, do you know the origins of false flag? It's from pirate times. They would hoist the flag of, say, the British. If there was a British ship over there, oh, hey, we're like you. We're one of you. Come close. And then we'll demolish you and board your ship and take all your stuff. It's that deception so that the enemy, or, so that we lower our defenses because we perceive something to be what it actually isn't. It's like the Trojan horse. So the United Nations and their goals and principles that we're supposedly aligned with as a church, I think is a front. I think it's garbage. I think you can't achieve those things through force. Violence is not how we advance principles of unity and love and charity. It is anathema to those ideals. And we as Latter-day Saints are commanded to awaken, to waste and wear out our lives in bringing to light the hidden things of darkness. I'm going to talk a little about that on next week's musing. To waste and wear out, wherein we know them. We're commanded to waste and wear out our lives in bringing to light the hidden things of darkness. And there are wolves in sheep's clothing. There are the Eubanks of the world who are being all buddy-buddy with these people and perceiving that there's some strategic advantage for the church to work with organizations like the United Nations and tell them that they need us to advance their sustainable development goals. If you want Agenda 2030 to succeed, you need religion, and you're not going to do it without us. And you can use church leaders to get people to lower their political objections. Now, she said that, to be fair, in the context of COVID, and yet the principle that she's espousing is to get this kind of diplomatic governmental community to leverage faith leaders as a way to speak out on issues to then persuade their congregations and adherents to drop their political opposition and get in line behind the Sustainable Development Goals and the United Nations agenda and principles, which we have a lot in common with, supposedly. Okay, little bonus at the end. Not United Nations related, but kind of. United Nations was doing a big conference in the past year or two on climate change. Surprise, surprise, right? And there's this organization called like the Elijah Interfaith Council or something like that. And they got together and they put out this manifesto. It's called the Elijah Interfaith Institute. And they said, oh, all these global leaders are going to be at this United Nations conference on climate change. Let's get all these people of faith together and let's create a list of principles for climate action and what they call climate repentance. For example, in their principles document, and it says, we need to give hope and meaning to individuals struggling under the burden of climate anxiety, who seek to find their place and identify their responsibility at this time of crisis. We must also confront honestly the destructive habits which continue to limit the possibilities and the hopes of human beings in a call for wake-up and self-examination. With the following 10 principles, we seek to initiate a process of climate repentance, broader understanding, and effective action. Climate repentance, people struggling under the burden of climate anxiety. You need to identify your responsibility, your carbon footprint. Shame on you for existing, your destructive habits, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, we know these crazy people are out there. We know these wackadoos are, pushing communism and government control under the auspices of a fake climate crisis that doesn't actually exist. And then it says a little bit down below, the following participants contributed to the creation of these 10 principles for climate repentance, or took part in the repentance ceremony. So they have this whole list of participants who, again, either contributed to the creation of this climate repentance document, manifesto, or took part in the repentance ceremony. You scroll down the list. David Bednar, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Huh? Why? Yeah. I'm at a loss of words, right? Again, we are supposed to be like guardians against this stuff. We should know, we should be able to see between the lines and the kind of plots and ploys of people who are trying to claim one thing but do another. We're told to awaken, we're told to pay attention, we're told to, be aware of these common, even the word of wisdom itself is predicated on, in consequence of the evil designs that are in the hearts of men, you need this word of wisdom, right? This corruption and conspiracy and colluding and central planning and the great whore in Babylon with a friggin' jaguar, tiger, eagle wing statue right out front to openly tell everyone, here's what we're about. And yet, leaders and members of our church are getting cozy, and I don't like it. And again, to be compassionate, I can see to some sense some strategic prudence when, the Nazi Gestapo are going to obliterate you if you don't get in line. Like, I can't say that I wouldn't want to protect the flock and make some reasonable concessions to some degree, to kind of keep the doors open for preaching the gospel and whatnot. I can't say that I wouldn't try and balance things or weigh those factors, right? But what's the standard that we should aspire for? Whether we rise to that standard or not, when we're in those circumstances, what is the standard? Should we be appeasing and getting cozy and showing the Nazis how we like genealogy too, just like you, because you're trying to find, purity lines in your blood to prove that you're all Aryan, racists or whatever, right? So should we kind of get cozy to them and say, we like these things too? Hey, United Nations, we like helping poor people too. Let's work together and let's all intermingle and be on panels and talk about sustainable development goals and blah, 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 right? Like, should we be doing that? Or should we be boldly pursuing God's commandments and those lofty goals through persuasion and voluntary action and repudiating violence and coercion and the state and Caesar? And helping the members understand that those worldly, corrupt, globalist, awful institutions are not the means by which we are supposed to be achieving God's commandments and the goals of helping other people and stopping poverty and feeding people and everything else. It's mixed messages to have the church news and the music and the spoken word and President Ballard and President Nelson tell us to be good global citizens and Elder Bednar saying we need climate repentance and, all these things on the one hand. And then our scriptures are saying this other stuff. And past church leaders have said other stuff. So what's going on? I don't know, but I don't like it. And it is a new year. And I hope we don't get a new world order. I mean, like you look over the past many, many, many decades. And every time there's a war, every time there's an economic crisis, every time there's a pandemic, every time one of these happens, you get these political leaders coming out and saying, oh, new world order, right? Like the actual term being utilized again and again and again. There are people who aspire to reshape society in their, in the manner that they desire. There are people who want to acquire power and wealth and use a crisis to their advantage to do so. That's literally the definition of a secret combination. It is these people who pulled up the plans of Master Mahan since time immemorial, right? I mean, it's when Cain slew Abel, it was all about, now I get my brother's stuff and I get away with it. Ha, ha, ha. I'm the greatest. Those are the plans that were dug up by, what's that chick's name that danced in the book of Jared and seduced the guy into, killing her grandpa to put her dad on the throne? Like all these things, it's the same plans. And it's happening today. And there are people aspiring for power and wealth and using these corrupt institutions and false flags to show people something different than what they are actually about. And if we don't kind of have eyes wide open of what's really going on, if we can't see that these lofty claims and sustainable development goals are really about political control, as has happened in decades past through the United Nations, and the transfer of wealth from poor nations to rich ones, and the centralization of authority and all of that, right? This very kind of satanic influence. If we can't recognize that, then something's wrong. Because it's been happening in decades past, it's happening today. And just because these lofty goals exist doesn't mean that we should be wearing their lapel pins and taking photos and being happy and going to their events. We should see through the lines. We should understand what's going on. We're a global church, but we shouldn't be globalists. We're a global church, but we shouldn't be, I think, good global citizens. We should be children of God, first and foremost. Citizens of his kingdom, not citizens of the state, not subjects of Caesar. We're here to do what God has told us to do, not inject crap into our bloodstream that's a supposedly miracle and safe and effective because someone made a phone call. I mean, I read a very interesting article someone sent me yesterday, and I will end here. And they were talking about how they think it's silly that people complain about a one world government. This gentleman's point was, we already have it. Because how else can you get, like, literally every country in the entire world to go lockstep in pursuit of a very specific action, to steamroll the rights and the dissenting opinions of their citizenry, to say lockdown economies, masks, vaccines, everyone's doing it. The example he gave was, look at America, where you have this kind of quasi-federation of states, and even at the county level, where some states were lighter touch than others, some states stayed open, some states resisted, some forced a vaccine, others didn't, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And his point was, in America, if you have this diversity of implementation, that shows that how on a global stage, you would think that there would be some kind of diversity of approach among nations, because there's so many polities, so many political bodies and cultures and people. And yet, when it came to the governmental response to COVID, it was nearly unanimous and identical. And so his point, his theory was, we have a global government. And it's not the United Nations. They didn't all go debate and pass a resolution, right? It's something else. It's something behind the scenes. It's something where someone placed a phone call and said, this is what everyone's now doing. And suddenly, it was all done. There was no dissent. There were no differing countries, really. There was, no debate. There were no countries saying, screw you, we're staying open. Everyone started shutting down, almost as if a phone call was placed and said, here's what we are doing across the world. It's kind of an interesting point to think about, where it's like, are the organizations that we think are fronting things? Oh, we're fronting the Sustainable Development Goals to be charitable and help people, that those are fronts for what the United Nations are really about. Under this theory, the United Nations itself is a bit of a front. The fact that we look at Dr. Evil at the World Economic Forum and, all these World Health Organization and all these groups, his theory was that those are a front themselves. They're distractions. They're not the true sources of authority. They're not the true conspiracy, the secret combination, the people in power. It was Edward Bernays who, was very tight with Woodrow Wilson and using propaganda in World War I. And I'm not going to be able to pull up the quote in time, but he wrote this book called Propaganda. It's up here on my shelf. Fantastic book. It's 100+ years old, short book, in which he talks about how propaganda works. And he says, and I'm going to slightly butcher this, but he says that the people who control the beliefs and actions of the masses are the true ruling class in the country and constitute an invisible government that people are not aware even exists. We are controlled, our thoughts designed, our actions guided by the decisions of men we do not know, and that is the true ruling power. And if that was the case 120 years ago, let's be frank, right? With advanced technology and all the rest, right? Do we really think stuff like that isn't happening today? We think we're so educated. We think we're so sophisticated. We think, government's never been more transparent, and we're a modern society. We would never be like poppycock, right? So it's a new year, new time to fight the New World Order. We don't need any of this globalist garbage. We need individual rights. We need agency. We need voluntary action. We need a commitment to be disciples of Christ, followers of the way. For those of you who have read Christ versus Caesar, if you haven't yet, go pick it up on Amazon. Wrote that a couple years ago. I consider it the greatest book I've ever written. Talking there about how the early Christians called themselves followers of the way, and we ought to do the same. Christ versus Caesar, go check it out. We have to be disciples of Christ. We have to reject these counterfeit institutions that claim to have the same goals and principles as God's kingdom and God's saints do. They don't. Their goals are different. Whether they're a front for the true ruling crazies behind the scenes who we don't even know or not, right? Our goals are not their goals. Our principles are not their principles. Notwithstanding what the church news and Lloyd Newell and all the rest are saying, I think Benson and J. Reuben Clark and others were right. I don't think things have gotten better. If anything, it's worse. His predictions, I think are accurate. We should be out of the United Nations. We should at least see it for what it is and not collude with it and support it and cozy up to it and say that they're very important and all this kind of stuff. We should not host them here and ingratiate themselves here in Utah, because what other city has the same aligned goals as the sustainable garbage? Okay, we'll wrap there. It's January 1st. I wish you all a Happy New Year. Do me a favor, if you enjoy Sunday Musings, head over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you listen. Leave a rating and a review. That helps boost the little algorithm. I just want to share with more people, and I'd love, I get so many positive messages from people who this kind of stuff helps. And what's that saying in the DNC? There are many who don't yet know because they haven't found it. I won't be so bold as to claim that, my musings are on par with pure gospel truth. But the point remains that there are many people I know who would benefit from hearing these types of messages, to know that they're not alone, to know that they're not crazy, to know that the kids aren't all right, and that the church culture needs fixing, and that we got work to do. So time to roll up our sleeves. We got a whole new year to do it. Let's work together, whatever that means for you and I. But let's fight the New World Order. See you next week.